Welcome to our new series for our small groups. We're going to spend the next 4 sessions exploring the book of Ruth from the Old Testament in our Bible. Ruth and I are going to have a conversation around some of the themes we find in chapter 1 of Ruth. But before we do that, a little bit of background. Ruth is a book that's set in the period of the Judges in Israel, and we need to understand that this was not a happy time. There were all kinds of things going on. There was a lot of immorality, a lot of idolatry, there was war. These were tough times. And we hear of the life of Ruth. Ruth was from Moab, and she is married to someone who comes from Bethlehem. But Ruth is widowed alongside her sister-in-law, who's called Orpah, and also their mother-in-law, who is Naomi. It seems that as we look through this story, that God honors Naomi's commitment by guiding her to find a new life, to discover a new way of living. Remember that being a widow meant that you had no way of supporting yourself in those days. It's really important that we hold that in our minds right through the book of Ruth. Interestingly as well, the book closes with a brief genealogy in which Boaz's name, so that is the person who she goes on to marry, who Ruth goes on to marry, Boaz's name is prominent as the great-grandfather of King David, through whom we would find Jesus in lots of years' time. The book of Ruth has often been discussed only as a story of Ruth finding a husband. But there's so much more going on in this book here. Let's not relegate it to that. This is a book that speaks to us about love and devotion and loyalty and choices. It's about survival. It's about trauma. It's about restoration and promise and hope. And another piece of information around genealogy is that Ruth is one of only 3 women mentioned in the genealogy of Jesus Christ, which can be found in Matthew chapter 1. So I've got a bit of an icebreaker for you to start with. So in a moment, pause and have this discussion. Have you ever been on a survival course or an expedition? And what was it like?
I hope you had some interesting sharing of stories as you shared in your group. There's something in this book of Ruth about survival, about trying to get by in what were very difficult circumstances. Losing husband in that context, as Catherine mentioned, was really quite a challenge. And so we've got this ongoing conversation where Ruth and Orpah both want to stay with Naomi, like straight away. They'll say, well, no, we'll stay with you, we'll stay with you. And it's both a tearful and a fearful conversation, because the knowing what comes next is always going to be a bit of a challenge, because these women have no way of fending for themselves because of the culture of the day. And so we're going to invite you to read together chapter 1.
Should I stay or should I go? They had a dilemma, did these 2 women, but they knew what they wanted to do. And in the end, Naomi tried to persuade both Ruth and Orpah to go back, to remain in their homeland. And she actually, and Orpah decides to do so, but Ruth doesn't. And the challenge comes to Ruth from Naomi. Look, your sister-in-law is going back to her people and her gods. Go back with her. And from that, we often end up with a bit of a narrative that says Ruth is this amazing, wonderful person, and Orpah is not. Is that fair?
Do you know what? I think you're right. It's really interesting, isn't it? Because after this, we don't really hear anything of Orpah after this in the Bible or anything at all. And yet Ruth's kind of held up as this kind of paragon of this is what you should have done, even though Naomi's very clear to say, you know, you need to go back. Because actually it's a really dangerous thing for Ruth to have made the decision, and therefore, you know, we hail bravery as a good thing. But actually, sometimes maybe we should be a little bit more fair on those who make sensible choices. And actually, it was a reasonable, sensible choice. Obviously, we kind of tie this into Ruth following a faith journey as well, because she's choosing Naomi's God over the gods of her kind of her ancestors, I guess. So I really do think we treat Orpah a little bit unfairly. But you know, so there's a kind of recognition that sometimes a sensible choice shouldn't be hailed as a bad choice.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you for that. Ruth's response did reveal a difference between Orpah and herself, I think. And we have what are perhaps some of the most famous words in the book of Ruth, when Ruth says, don't urge me to leave you or to turn back from you. Where you go, I will go. And where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, if even death separates you and me. So,
strong words, aren't they?
Really strong words, and words that do suggest a really strong bond between mother-in-law and Ruth, daughter-in-law.
Yeah, it's really interesting, isn't it? Because we kind of often berate those relationships, don't we, and joke about the kind of in-law relationships. But I can only but assume or imagine that either what Ruth knew that she would be going back to wasn't actually that great. But I don't know that that's the case, because I don't know that Naomi would have wanted her to go back if that was the case. Yeah. But actually, that there's something phenomenal about that relationship between Naomi and Ruth, isn't there? That real sense of dedication to her mother-in-law. And I just think, because there may be about 20 years difference between them, but something about that, those kind of relationships that are, I guess, are really rare for us, that when you find that person that you just really click with, and that dedication to go, no, whatever is for you is for me as well. And, you know, and in that whole, that, you know, your people will be my people, your God, my God. That's her really kind of taking that faith step and to say, actually, you know, this is the journey I want to follow now. Yeah,
and that's great. That's a really kind of traditional and understood way of dealing with this story, isn't it? Interestingly, in our preparations, we've done some reading around this, and Dr. Rachel Starr writes on the book of Ruth, and she offers what she calls a less joyful interpretation, and it is less joyful. She talks about this decision of Ruth to go with Naomi being more of a contract, and she talks about it. Possibly in desperation, Ruth enslaves herself to Naomi in exchange for Naomi's protection in a foreign land, for a chance of survival. And then goes on to say, in turn, Naomi profits of Ruth's work in the fields as she gleans in the corn. So that gives a very different picture. And if I'm honest, I'm not sure I sit with this. I get that it's looking beyond the surface.
Yeah, absolutely.
To looking at the culture of the day a bit more. Yeah. But I do think throughout the book of Ruth, there is a real sense of this true dynamic of relationship between Ruth and Naomi.
Absolutely. And I think that whole thing of within this, it'd have to be a very twisted relationship in lots of ways for Ruth to choose something that was going to be incredibly difficult for her to go with Naomi. And all the time, Naomi's like, no, you go back to your own mother who would have kind of been her guide in all things. But instead, she makes a choice. All the way through, this is about Ruth choosing something. So to say that she enslaves herself to Naomi, I can see where this interpretation comes from. And I think we need to be really aware of those things, because I think sometimes in our conversations about relationship dynamics, something that may look like dedication can be actually quite twisted and be something very, very different. So it's really important to have these interpretations to kind of raise those little flags. But actually, I think for me, as we read this, I just see Ruth making a very strong choice, a very difficult choice, a very brave choice. Obviously, we can pick up later, the kind of outcomes of those choices.
Yeah. So, how does any of this resonate with you today? There are going to be some questions which will be on your screen, and we really hope you have some good conversations as you explore, particularly this chapter of the book of Ruth.